If you had said to me a year ago that I would become a member of Congress during an infectious disease outbreak, that I would witness an insurrection against the US Capitol during the Electoral College vote count, and that I would impeach a president who had been impeached once before, and all of that would happen within the first 2 weeks.
When Representative Ritchie Torres arrived to Washington, he could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. He's the first Afro Latino openly gay person elected to Congress, the son of a black mother and a Puerto Rican father. He was raised in a housing project and struggled with issues all too common among his own constituents. Torres has risen to represent the poorest congressional district in the U.S. Before making history in Congress, Torres made history as the youngest member of the New York City Council at age 25. What connection do you have with Abraham Lincoln, you feel?
Abraham Lincoln is the greatest president in the history of our country. And I strive to be a leader like Abraham Lincoln, who is never threatened by diversity of opinion, even within my own ranks.
While his journey from poverty to the national stage shaped his political career, his goal to secure funding for affordable housing has remained the same. You've talked about being in poverty. How does that shape the way that you approach and think about politics and policy?
The impact is profound. I think we are all products of our lived experiences. I actually grew up in a public housing development right across the street from Trump Golf Course. And so when the golf course was undergoing construction, it unleashed a skunk infestation.
Oh.
What was striking about that experience is I saw the city government invest more than $100 million for a gilded gated golf course for Donald Trump.
You've also talked openly about struggling with substance abuse, with depression, having suicidal thoughts at times.
I bring an unusual set of lived experiences to Congress. About 15 years ago, I dropped out of college because I found myself struggling with depression. And I would not be alive today were it not for mental health care, which saved my life.
You are the first Afro Latino openly gay congressman.
There has been slightly more than 160 black members of Congress, and none of them were openly LGBTQ until Mondaire Jones and I were sworn in. I experienced representation both as a burden and as a blessing.
You guys were in for 3 days, and then the insurrection happens on January 6th. How has that changed the way you think about politics?
You know, the juxtaposition between the insurrection and the inauguration, I think, tells a larger story about American politics. There's the reality of multiracial democracy. But then there's the opposing reality of white supremacy. But there was no greater inspiration for me than the inauguration. The image of the first woman, the first African American, the first Asian American, Kamala Harris, being sworn in as vice president by the first Latina on the Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor.
One of the kind of biggest priorities for the Biden-Harris administration is equity. What work should be done for racial equity in this country?
COVID-19 is a disease of systemic racism, and it should be the mission of the Biden administration to address those inequalities and injustices. When you consider the prevalence of pre-existing conditions, the overcrowding of apartments, the occupational hazards of the essential workforce, the high rates of pollution and poverty, and that to me is the clearest distillation of systemic racism in America. And it explains why we have to be proactive in pursuing racial equity.
And how do you pursue that with the current Congress setup that we have?
Bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship is overrated. Reconciliation is the kind of unity I believe in. We as a society have determined that education is so fundamental that every child should have access to education. But we have not similarly determined that housing is so fundamental.
One of the calls right now is defunding the police. You've called it arbitrary and irresponsible.
What I described as arbitrary and irresponsible was the New York City Democratic Socialist proposal to defund the NYPD by 50%. What happens if it leads to an outbreak of gang violence and youth violence and gun violence? My three highest priorities are a permanent expansion of the child tax credit, funding for public housing, and third, vouchers for all, housing vouchers for all. You know, housing is a human right, and no family in need should pay more than 30% of their income toward their rent. The most important question I can ask myself as a public servant is, am I doing right by the essential mothers and workers of the South Bronx? Like, that to me is the standard of success.